Thank you, Jack. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you today about community disaster resilience. To what and for whom? What I'd like to do is to begin with the definition that I will be using because resilience means different things to different communities. And here we're looking at the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to actual, but also potential adverse events. The notion of resilience is an old notion, and there are many, many different definitions of it, depending on which discipline you come from. I've put a few of the definitions here on the screen. People working in the field of ecology have different definitions than people who work in the health sciences. In the disaster sciences, we use the definition that I started with. One of the elements of resilience is thinking about not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. And this pertains mostly to the disaster realm because what you want to do is improve the conditions, not go back to a condition that was not that acceptable from a societal perspective. The different elements within resilience results in some contested views. And some of the questions relate to, well, what are we talking about? Resilience for whom? Whom are we focusing in on this resilience? Or resilience to what? And what we see is there are conceptual tensions within the disaster science about whether or not resilience is an equilibrium state or a non-equilibrium state, whether it is a positive construct, whether it's an outcome, which gets to the resilience to what, or whether or not it's a process of becoming more resilient. And what we see is a lot of different questions come out in the literature, which is why when most people begin to talk about resilience, they start with the definition that they are using in their own domain. And so, again, reiterating what we mean by resilience. There are multiple foci of resilience. And again, depending on disciplinary backgrounds, you may simply be looking at individual scale resilience, whether it's a person, a household, or structures. Engineers deal with resilience, but they look at it in terms of an individual building, for example. We can also look at resilience from the perspective of groups or aggregations, social groups, for example, the elderly. We can look at it by sector, the business sector. We can look at it infrastructure, for example. And then as a geographer, we can also look at these systems in a spatial perspective. And the spatial perspective can be ecosystems, but it could also be urban areas or communities themselves. What is really interesting about resilience from a conceptual basis is it tends to be siloed depending on the disciplinary perspective. So ecological resilience, you don't find many in the disaster field looking at the work in the ecological resilience field, engineering resilience, and so forth. But increasingly, because the world is becoming more interdependent, we're beginning to see mergers of resilience across these different silos. So we can get ecological resilience looking at social ecological resilience in an urban context. And there's quite a bit of work done in urban ecological resilience. Similarly, we can look at engineering, looking at people working in the social domain, and we're getting socio-technical resilience coming to the fore. So we're moving from a more strict focus, disciplinary focus, into an interdisciplinary and often transdisciplinary kind of field, which is what resilience is in many ways morphing into. That provides, I think, a fast sort of conceptualization of this broad field of resilience. But what I want to spend time on is talking about how that concept made it into policy. And it started back in 2005 when a subcommittee for natural disaster came out with the grand challenges in trying to figure out ways to reduce the impacts of hazards and disasters on the United States. And these grand challenges focused initially on vulnerability, but the vulnerability language didn't settle well with the federal government. And so one of the people on the committee said, well, let's take the negative of vulnerability and turn it into a positive, and let's talk about resilience and what we as a nation can do to make our communities more resilient. And that led to a study that was proposed to the National Academy of Sciences that was funded by 8 different federal agencies, which is essentially unheard of for an academy study. And that academy study was a 2-year effort that resulted in a groundbreaking monograph called Disaster Resilience, a National Imperative. And this study led to a huge governmental effort to focus in on resilience. It supported, had lots of conclusions in it, wanted to create community resilience coalitions to invest in resilience, to figure out how we measure resilience, how we develop a scorecard, and how federal agencies can promote this effort. It led to, because of the groundbreaking nature of it, quite a bit of effort was spent by the Academy to disseminate the findings, people working on a national conversation, going into Congress, talking to a variety of different constituencies, briefings about what the federal agencies could do. And ultimately, what was the result was the focus on lots of things in resilience that started to come to the fore. At about the same time, we had the federal government in the US looking at resilience, but we also had the private and philanthropy sectors, such as Rockefeller Foundation creating their 100 Resilient Cities and working from many of these same conceptual efforts. There was an attempt from the Rockefeller to create a resilience officer in the 100 cities globally to try and stimulate disaster risk reduction. We see resilience coming up throughout many different venues, lots and lots of private, public sector engagement with resilience, along with the federal resilience as well. And we saw the national academies jump into resilience in a big way through setting up a roundtable where they would have periodic meetings and moving the understanding of resilience forward, lots of different academy studies coming out. lots and lots of activity from this 2009 to 2019 era. But what we see is lots and lots of activities, but it was really hard to figure out who was doing what and what were they doing. And what you see is the landscape of resilience was really all over the place in terms of indices and indicators and variables and approaches and what do we do? How do we know if we're becoming resilient? How do we know what works? So what we saw was a range of opportunities, a range of attempts to try and figure out what was this thing, resilience, from a policy perspective, and how could we enhance the American resilience. Well, what we saw when you looked at it were from the perspective of a community, that if we think of communities as an integrated system of systems, there's a political system, an economic system, a social system. When you started to look at all these efforts, we see that there are capitals that are basically similar across many of these schemes that were developed. And so these became the essential capitals for monitoring community resilience: the human capital, the financial capital, built environment, institutional, the social capital in communities, and also environmental or natural capital. But how do you measure these? How do you go about measuring? Because if you're interested in improving your resilience, you have to have a baseline. So how do you start with that baseline? What do you measure? How do you measure? What data do you use? And most significantly, how do you know if you got it right? Well, there's lots of conversations about assessment informatics. What is your object of analysis? Is it just the assets in a community? Is it capacity? Are you interested in acute shocks or chronic shocks? Are you interested in only natural or technological, a singular shock, continuous shock? What is your unit of analysis? Do you just want to focus on administrative boundaries? Do you want to use a local community? Do you want to use physical boundaries? So these are all the kinds of questions that we're starting to come up in figuring out how are we actually going to go forward in measuring resilience. Well, first and foremost, we need to create a baseline, and there was no baseline for resilience. And so how do you know if the program that you're trying to implement has been effective, or the targets that you're interested in have been reached, if you don't know where you started? So the challenges in doing this is you needed to have a simple approach, something that could be replicated over time, something that was evidence-based, and something that was meaningful from a local community member all the way up to the federal government. In other words, this was a really large task. There were lots of different attempts to do this. Some were more successful than others. And what I want to do is just give you an example of one such attempt to measure a baseline. And this is called the Baseline Resilience Index for communities. And you'll notice that the components reflect those common capitals that we found in a variety of different studies, but it really looks at them in an integrated fashion. And this integrated fashion is theoretically informed by something that we developed a number of years ago called the DROP model, the Disaster Resilience of Place model. And this model suggests that there is an integration between the social systems, the built environment, and natural systems. And within that Venn diagram, if you wanted to look at it that way, there was some inherent vulnerability in these systems, but there was also some inherent resilience in these systems. And to keep in mind that just because you're vulnerable doesn't mean that you lack resilience, that there is some distinction between vulnerability as a concept and resilience as a concept, but there is also a small amount of overlap between those two. So we began thinking about how we would go about measuring resilience and coming up with resilience indicators that were not computer intensive, so that someone at a local level could use secondary data and create their own baseline resilience. So the preference for us was to use a national data set primarily from census, and to recognize that we would want to have periodic updates of that information so that we could monitor change over time, but we could also monitor spatial change as well. What we ended up with was a simple formula where variables were selected representing each one of these capitals. We simply scaled the values from 0 to 1, and we basically had a hierarchical model that we used, and we summed all of these min-max values for each capital, and then summed each capital across to create the overall index. This was easily done and is easily done in an Excel spreadsheet. Because we have no theoretical basis for determining the weighting, we use an equal weighting for this, the assumption being that community capital has the same weight as social capital or economic capital, for example. And because we're geographers, the first thing we do is we map it so that we can understand the spatial distribution. And what you see here on this map are the values for 2015 of the BRIC index by county, US county. And the areas in dark purple are those that have the lowest amount of resilience, and those that have dark green have the highest amount of resilience. And if you know something about the geography of the United States, if you look in the eastern half of the United States, what stands out are those purple areas in Appalachia, those purple areas along what is the old cotton belt in the south. We see parts of Florida also coming out as having relatively low resilience, but the highest resilient are found in the northern corridor states, and there are some explanations of that, which I will come to. What is interesting about the mapping of the resilience and the way in which the index was constructed is you can deconstruct it, and you can look at what is driving some of these scores. And what we see in particular is in the West, it's some of the community capital is lower, and that's what's contributing a lot. These are areas where you've got very little interaction within a community. These are rural places generally. And so you can not only look at it from the perspective of the whole of the United States, but we can begin to figure out, well, what are some of these driving factors that are contributing to this baseline? We can do this geographically or spatially. We can also look at the individual scores, and I've given the top 3 or so, the bottom 3 or so, and I've given the county where Michigan State is located. And you can see here at a glance, those scores that are circled are those places that capital that is the lowest of all the capitals. And this is where you can put resources to improve your score. And interestingly, for 2015, most of the places that are high overall in their score here can be improved even more through housing and infrastructure improvements, which is interesting given some of the legislation that has come out during the Biden administration with the capital improvements. Where you are in Michigan is basically slightly above the US average. And so you have a relatively good score on your county resilience. The lower scores are extremely rural areas. La Paz is a border community with Arizona and California. It has a population of about 16,000 people. Very, very low scores across the board. Hudspeth, Texas is a border town south of El Paso, 3,000 population. And Esmeralda, Nevada is also a very, very rural area along the Nevada-California border with Death Valley. Again, very, very low population rural areas. We can begin to distinguish between urban and rural areas because we see that there are differences, and the drivers for rural areas are significantly different in the resilience than the same drivers for urban areas. Clearly, economic capital is a major significant driver for improving urban resilience, whereas the significant drivers for rural places are the community capital, where communities come together, and the environmental capital. Because we're relying on specific patterns and data, federal data, we can go back and reconstruct over time these indicators. We're using primarily the American Community Survey data, which comes out every 5 years. And so we can monitor the spatial and temporal trends over time, as you see here, and show which places are improving in their resilience, which places are staying the same in their resilience, and which places are declining in their resilience. So there's a lot of proof of concept that's going on in looking at this BRIC index. It turns out that as we were developing the BRIC index, FEMA was also interested in compiling a national risk index that looked at the risk as the expected annual loss from natural hazards, the social vulnerability of these places, generally counties, and then the resilience of these places. We were fortunate enough to provide the 3 primary sources of data for the initial development of FEMA's National Risk Index. The expected annual loss uses a product that we developed called the Shieldus database. The Shieldus database is a county level data set that includes property and crop loss, death and injuries, and for 18 different natural hazards by county for the whole US, starting in 1960 and going to the present. Shieldus is now licensed to Arizona State, who is running the Shieldus database, and it was ingested and used in partnership with FEMA to develop the average annual losses. On the social vulnerability side, we had also developed the Social Vulnerability Index, which is an index of the demographic characteristics that influence the social vulnerability, things related to your age, your income, your educational levels, these sorts of things. SOVI was initially part of the National Risk Index, and in the second version of it, they went from the SOVI construction to a Centers for Disease Control product, also called Social Vulnerability, CDC Social Vulnerability. And then you notice here, community resilience used the BRIC index. And so we provided updated BRIC index for FEMA that got ingested into that particular product. This is an online database that you can basically download the data. It works exceedingly well for FEMA's purposes in trying to develop a portal for communities to come into to see what their risk is from one of these 18 different hazards or all of them. So what we've done is we've taken this theoretical approach, we've created a tool which is now an application that is used by the federal government. The question is, though, what is the recipe for building resilience? The data are nice, but what is the recipe? How do we think about this? We can have the numeric evidentiary basis, but we need to have some flexible strategies and multiple tools, because a one-size-fits-all is not going to work. We need to build stronger local capacities, but we don't need to build it everywhere, because some places have very good capacity already. So what are some of the ingredients that are necessary for building resilience? Well, we need these baselines. We need to know where we started. BRIC is one type of a baseline. It's not perfect. There's always room for improvement, but it is serving the purpose of figuring out where we are now and then looking at what communities want to be aspirational. We have to understand the investments and the benefits we're going to get from these investments. We need to ensure that there's equity in how these measurements are applied. So this gets to the question of for whom. And we need to make resilience not as a separate kind of factor for communities, but it should be part of their overall planning and development efforts. And that this one size metric may not work at a community level, but works quite well when you're thinking about a national picture in an application for something like FEMA. What we know is that these measurement tools are helpful in identifying risk, in figuring out where we're lacking in capacity, resilience, and taking some steps toward reducing our vulnerability and enhancing our resilience. And in getting communities and stakeholders to work together. And this is one of these instances where to improve your community resilience, it does take a village. It does take a community. The tools themselves, the measurement themselves, don't create a resilient community, but they can show you the path. And the path enables these communities to become more vibrant in the face of many unanticipated events and provides an aspirational vision for the future before an event occurs and certainly afterward. And I am reminded of that 2012 study that the National Academies did. And the study that I had the privilege of chairing the committee. The first thing that the study did was to create an aspirational vision of what we thought a resilient nation would look like in 2030. And we're coming up on being 5 years until 2030. And we wanted a resilient nation to have individuals and communities with the first line of defense against disasters, that there was national leadership in resilience in both the federal agencies and Congress, and that communities receive funding and investment and support for resilience efforts, that risk information is readily available and effectively communicated. And this vision led to the creation of the National Risk Index. We envisioned that zoning ordinances were enacted, but more importantly, were enforced, and that building codes and retrofit standards were widely adopted, but also enforced. That a significant proportion of the recovery after disasters would be funded through private capital and insurance payouts, that insurance premiums themselves became risk-based, that the communities had contingency plans to provide services for the most vulnerable populations during a recovery from a disaster, and that the disaster recovery itself was accelerated by infrastructure redundancy and upgrades. And what we wanted to achieve was that the resilient nation in 2030 would have a vibrant and diverse economy and a safer, healthier, and better educated citizenry than previous generations. I think we're well on the way to achieving that 2030 vision, but we do have some ways to go. And with that, I thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Carter, for your really fantastic lecture. It's very informative, insightful, inspiring. Now it's time for questions. Again, the audience is welcome to post questions in the Q&A box. I see there are already questions there. The first question is from, let's see, Clara Groh-Cobb. Thank you for your great talk. I'm a resilience scholar based in the social, ecological, technological systems resilience, i.e. seeing resilience as an emergent property that is neither good nor bad. Knowing that there are systems that are very vulnerable, highly resilient in that vulnerable state. I'm curious whether you have any experience or insight into how policy or policymakers are thinking about that. All the policy documents I see seems to just want to build more resilient? Where and how do they talk about breaking the bad resilience of highly vulnerable systems? Thank you.
Wow. That's a whole talk in and of its self. And it gets back to understanding which systems you're looking at and which perspective you are looking from. Presumably, from your question, you seem to be focused in on sets, socio-ecological technical systems, and what we're seeing on the policy realm in a disaster context, if I can move it in that direction, is an increasingly understanding of compound hazards and cascading hazards, where you do have some of these attributes of the systems and increasing failure of some of the systems and increasing resilience of other systems. So I'm not really sure that I've answered your question, but there is an increasing movement in the policy world to begin to think about these compound hazards as they're affecting different places. Whether or not there was going to be any policy recommendation coming from that, I doubt it at the moment, but at least in some instances, communities are recognizing that all of this fits together and that they can't just solve one problem and leave the other parts of the system out in that consideration. I hope that answers your question, at least partially.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is from anonymous attendee. Thank you for your great talk. I'm wondering if the BRIC index accounts for connectivity of each county, or if each county's score is calculated individually. For example, a low score county right next to a high score county could readily receive resources from the nearby high score county. So basically talk about how county is next to each
Right.
other, help each other.
Right,
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right. Right now, the BRIC score is done individually for each county, but we've not done the experimentation with the connectivity, other than doing some of the spatial statistics. So I understand your point where you could have a high school in one county that is servicing another county, and it's right on its border. Part of the effort in developing an index is to keep it as simple as possible without getting overly complicated that it couldn't be done on an Excel spreadsheet by an emergency manager. There is a lot of work, however, theoretical and statistical work being done by folks who are focusing in on this notion of connectivity in terms of social networks, for example. And so that when that gets to a place where it's easily understood and implemented, that could be something that could be added to the BRIC index, for example.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is from Tom Dees. He said, you have built an amazing program of work, advanced both understanding and the potential for action. a question for you. The resilience community has long emphasized engagement with interested and impact parties. A number of NRC studies call for linking analysis with the public deliberation when in many domains. But as we have seen recently, designing processes for that is challenging. Is a wisdom from the resilience community on how to do this?
There are a number of scholars who are working on this connectivity between the empirical and the stakeholder engagement, and actually getting more involved on that engagement stakeholder side. We're working in trying to figure out a way of downscaling the BRIC index to something that's useful for a community. Right now, it's not useful because it's county. And so we're moving down that path of stakeholder engagement as well. What do they find important in their community? And how can we take that integration between the community and what we know in terms of co-developing a locally based resilience measure? And so we've done some experimentation here with the state of South Carolina in doing that. And I have a number of students who are actually now trying to work on that angle. So right now, BRIC is a top down. I don't think it's very satisfying for a community. So I want to make a difference. I want to have my students make a difference. So we're now going into the community with active engagement with communities to see if we can build something from the bottom up, and hopefully they'll meet in the middle. At least that's the theory.
Yeah, thank you so much. The next question is from anonymous attendee. The question is, how can resiliency planning support the strengthening of federal support for programs supporting communities dealing with acute stressors, like hurricanes, for example? And how can this material support for those experience those problems, and how can they be most, impactful with this kind of support?
Right. One of the ways in which this is being done is there are a couple of programs where there's enhanced federal support to those communities that are the most vulnerable and the least resilient. And so these have been identified by the National Risk Index and by states. And so there is enhanced resources that are going into these places, the most vulnerable census tracts, for example, and also the least resilient census tracts, to try and enhance capacity in these areas. This is an effort by FEMA, but there's also additional efforts by EPA, for example, through their climate justice efforts to try and improve the resilience of many of these different places. So we're starting to see movement and the allocation of resources, the differential allocation of resources to those places that are most in need. And that hasn't always been the case with federal dollars.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Delia Cano. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering whether these resilience indices have been contrasted with extreme weather outcomes. For instance, whether two communities with the same resilience level failed failed a weather event similarly or not. Thanks a lot again.
The short answer is not yet. The index only goes back to 2010, and we would have to have and look at the impacts of certain disaster events, for example, and do a back casting to see if the resilience made any difference in the long-term effect of that particular event. I think the team here, it's on our list of things to do, but we haven't done it yet because we're still trying to look at the temporal and spatial change in the index before going back and seeing if it actually made a difference in trying to figure out the localized impact of a particular disaster event.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is from Virginia Dale. She said, fantastic lecture. Your examples largely focus on the social, institutional, infrastructure, and the economic aspect of resilience. What do you suggest for better inclusion of the ecological considerations?
Thank you. That's a great question. We are captive of data. And it's very hard to find a national data set of ecological resilience. And so we're using proxies that are not the best. So until we can see some improvement in the environmental data that we can include, it will always be things like, the percentage of land cover and wetlands, things of that nature, where we have a national data set. The reason we keep to national data sets is we can assume that those data are equally bad or equally good when collected at the national level, and that the variability reflects the variability due to the particular places, rather than variability in the data because it was collected in state A, which is better at collecting data than state B. So that's one of the reasons why we use the national data sets. But it's a great question.
Yeah, regarding that, I'm wondering if remote sensing data, like you just mentioned, land cover data, could be used because it's national, not just national, but also global. You can detect the wetland, the forest, and other ecological features.
Right, but you can't collect water usage or energy usage. Those are also part of the environmental domain, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's not, yeah.
So there may be a need for integrating those consumption data from different places with the ecological data, because like each township accounts for how much water each household use, for example. They charge you based on the amount of water you use, and then yeah, you have to pay for those.
But it's finding, I mean, we have a whole wish list of variables that we'd love to have for environment, and we spent 3 or 4 years trying to find consistent data sets, and it's just really hard to do. So we end up just taking what we can find that has adequate data at the time. As I mentioned before, the BRIC index is not perfect. We're the first ones to tell you that. But it's something to start with. And I'm hoping that as it gets out more and more, and we've done a lot of the QA/QC on the data, and people begin to think a little bit more about resilience, that they can come up with better proxies and improve it and move the science of resilience indicators forward in new and exciting ways.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So the next question is from Yinjie Fu. Thank you for your insightful talk. Social capital plays important roles in community resilience. Could you share some thoughts on how to measure social capital in communities?
Some of the ways in which we use the measures of social capital are engagement with communities, how many churches, what is attendance in churches, which are meeting places, how many social organizations are in a community, what is the length of residence of people in a community, how tied are they to the community, what is their sense of place. So these are all kind of proxies, but there's been a lot of work done in the sociology about social capital and how you can actually measure the connectivity of social capital, but it isn't necessarily a spatial measure.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The next one actually is a follow-up question from Virginia Dale. She said, it would be useful for your team to publish that list of needed and useful indicators for assessing ecological resilience. Have you done that?
No, but I'm just going to make a little list here.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
We do publish. We have a web page on BRIC that lists all the indicators, and you can download the data, the aggregated data for that. But we haven't published our wish list, but I think that's probably a good idea. And we could just add that to that BRIC page and encourage people to have a look and see what they can do. It's a great idea.
Yeah, that's great. You know, on that issue, one of the things that wondering if you have the index, how the index incorporate factors nearby and even far away that may have impact on the resilience. And because some community may highly depend on the support from outside, or so.
Yep.
And
These
another,
are
yeah,
no, that's the perfect issue with resilience, right?
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
perfect issue with scale
yeah,
because everything is connected.
yeah,
And
yeah,
where do you draw the boundary?
yeah,
And we drew the boundary around an administrative unit, county,
yeah,
and assumed
yeah,
there was no inflow and outflow
yeah,
from that.
yeah,
Otherwise, we would not have gotten anything published ever.
yeah. I think that lay a great foundation for the
Mhm.
future.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that will account for those factors far
Right.
away and nearby, and how they interact, and so on
Right.
and so forth.
Right. It's the idea of the teleconnections.
Yeah, teleconnection, telecoupling. Yeah, that's I think not just the social environmental connection over distance, but also the social economic
It's all
connections.
of it. Right.
Yeah, at the
Right.
same time. Yeah. So and also I'm wondering if you see politically different in among different states, especially like red states and blue states in accepting the indices that you developed?
Um, no. Um, we do see that those states that are more proactive with emergency management and the development of hazard mitigation plans, for example, or resilience plans are more likely to use the index than those that are less proactive. And there's not really a red state, blue state element to that, as best
Okay,
we can tell.
great. Yeah. So next actually is a comment from Jared Ross. He said, very interesting lecture. Thanks so much for sharing your work. Um, more of information purpose regarding the ecological resilience related information. He said that the Nature Conservancy had
Yeah.
some national scale resilience information recently compiled and released separately from terrestrial and aquatical perspectives. And he listed a couple of links there.
Okay.
So, and the Zoom.
Great. Thank
Yeah.
you for that.
So yeah, that's great. I wish we have more time, but we already run out of time. So the presentation and the Q&A are so interesting, and so thank you so much again, Professor Carter, for really wonderful lecture. And also I want to thank the audience for their active participation. And we have to say goodbye now, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day or enjoy the rest of the evening, depending on where you are around the world. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.